I was born in 1921 in North Calcutta in a place called Garpar, on Garpar Road, where my family business was. Actually, our house was 50% of it consisted of the printing press and the block making establishment, which was the front of the house. We lived in the back of the house. And no, I don't think I had a lonely childhood at all, because I had, and it never struck me as being a lonely childhood, because not being able to compare with other children who had lots of friends and brothers and sisters, I was perfectly happy. I spent a lot of time in the printing press, and my afternoons were spent with the compositors, with the block makers and all that. I used to stroll around. And that was a fascinating experience. And I had, my friends were my maidservant's son, and a few cousins of mine who would drop in from time to time and spend a week or a month in our house. And my mother was there, my uncles were there. So it was not a lonely childhood at all, as far as I can remember. Later, of course, in my maternal uncle's house, again, I was the only one of my age. Until the age of 9, I didn't join school because my mother taught me at home everything that I had to learn. Then I joined school at the age of 10, which was the Ballygunge Government High School. And then I had lots of friends at school. But we moved. My uncle's first house was in Bhawanipur, Gokul Bagan Road, and then we moved from there we moved to Ballygunge and Beltala Road, and there I became a member of a club. I was something like 12 or 13 at that time. A club in the neighborhood. We played games. We played cricket and hockey and badminton. And I was also terribly fond of indoor games, even games which only one person could play. So I had plenty of opportunity to keep myself occupied. And I did a lot of sketching. I did a lot of reading. I was very fond of books. And so that's that. And from a very early age, of course, this love of what we used to call the bioscope then, which became cinema much later. That was there. Not that I was able to go to see too many films at that age, but as I grew up, that became a part of a normal weekly entertainment or monthly entertainment. Well, actually, when I was born, the Renaissance was already over. The Renaissance actually refers to a period which, shall we say, started around 1820s, 30s, and went on till about the end of the 19th century. Beyond that, there wasn't very much of that kind of activity going on. Certainly, my grandfather made a great deal of contribution to the. He was what would be called a Renaissance figure because of his various accomplishments. He was a writer, poet, painter, musician, and everything, and even a technical expert. He was also a block maker of quite outstanding merit and all that. And my father, who lived only 35 years, he was very much like my grandfather in the sense that he was also a very gifted man in various directions. He was also a poet, painter, writer, and he was also involved in this printing business that we had. But I was aware of all this. I didn't, my grandfather died 6 or 7 years before I was born. And when my father died, I was only 2 years old. So I don't even remember him. And I lived in my ancestral home till the age of 6. Then I had to leave because our business fell through. I mean, so we had no reason to stay on in North Calcutta, and I moved to my maternal uncle's house. So actually there have been no real direct connection with Renaissance, but our awareness of the Renaissance was already there. And in course of time, I developed certain gifts of my own, in the sense that I was, from a very early age, I used to draw and sketch very well. I was born up in an atmosphere of music, so I was very conscious of music. And I had a certain ability to sing myself. And much later, of course, I became a writer also, but that came much later. But I can't say that it was more a kind of genetic influence than anything else, because I was not directly influenced by either by my father or my grandfather. But the awareness was there. In Santiniketan, two things happened. One, came under the influence of Nandalal Bose, our teacher, who was the principal of Kalabhavan. And at a later stage, in the second year, I was taught also by a marvelous painter, Binod Bihari Mukherjee. And the second thing that happened was that there was a professor, Jewish-German professor, who was teaching in comparative literature in Santiniketan. And even before I went to Santiniketan, I learned that he was also a pianist, and he had a collection of Western classical music. By that time, I had built up my own small collection of Western classical music, and I took my records with me and a gramophone. And I struck up a friendship with Dr. Aronson, who was this Jewish-German professor. So my evenings were spent in listening either to gramophone records in his house, in his little room, or both of us would go to Uttarayan, which was the building where Tagore lived. Well, it was one of the 3 or 4 buildings where Tagore lived. I think he was living in Udichi, another small building at that time. And in Uttarayan, there was an old piano, which originally belonged to Tagore's niece, Indira Devi Chodrani. And he would play the piano. He had the score. He had Beethoven pieces. And I would turn the pages for him. That is how I got to be familiar with Western notation at that time, which was a very, very useful lesson for me, because it came in very handy much later. And there was also another very fine painter, sculptor at that time, Ramkinkar Bej. So all 3 were instrumental in instilling in me a love of Indian classical art. Anyway, I came here, and after 6 months, I joined this firm of DJ Kamers. Now, what I tried to do, and I suppose eventually succeeded in doing, was introduce Indian traditional elements into graphic design, in illustrations also. I was constantly using the brush as a medium, as against the pen, which normal westernized commercial artists would do. So I used the brush a lot. I used Indian ink. I used certain Indian papers also. And I also introduced Indian calligraphy with brush. A calligraphic tradition, of course, we've had for a very long time, but that was never used in in advertising art at all. But I think I was the first to introduce Indian traditional calligraphic styles into Indian advertising. And then, of course, even while I was with Kemas, I started doing work for a new firm of publishers called Signet Press. Actually, the owner of the Signet Press was the assistant manager of DJ Kemas. So I could do my work for the publishers while sitting in my office itself. So that was a great help. And I think I was also able to introduce a lot of Indian elements, Indian color schemes, Indian composition, Indian motifs in my book jacket design. And I personally feel that those are my contributions. And those are the contributions which gave them a certain distinction. Ray Roman came much later. That was when I was already a filmmaker, and there was an international competition announced for typeface designing by an American firm. And I designed 4 original English typefaces. One of them was Ray Roman. And actually the top prizes were all won by Swiss designers. But there were some which they selected for marketing. And I was offered a lifetime, share of whatever they were earning from it. And Ray Roman was the one that did selected for marketing. So that's how Ray Roman came about. The idea of making a film of Panchali first came to me when I was doing illustrations for an abridged edition of the book for Signet Press. And this was way back in 1946. It was a year before we started the Film Society in Calcutta, the film club. And naturally, I was already getting very seriously interested in the cinema. But there was no question, it was still only an idea because I had this very safe job. I was the art director of this firm. And there was no question of quitting the job at that stage. But then in 1950, I went to London to work in the head office of DJ Kema. And there I managed to see a great many films which made a strong impression on me. And on the way, on the boat, on the way back, I wrote a sort of treatment, a rough treatment of the film. And after coming back, for a year, we were trying to find a producer, somebody who would put up the money for the project. But that didn't happen because we were all new. I was new. I was hoping to use new technicians, possibly new actors, so nobody was really interested. None of the conventional producers were interested. And then we decided, when it became an obsession with me, and I had by that time lost interest in advertising, I was anxious to get back into filmmaking, go into filmmaking, and there I decided to take a loan against my insurance policies, which gave me something like 7,000 or 8,000 rupees, and we started with that small money. Well, there are no special problems involved with filming a literary classic. Um, my first 6 or 7 films were all based on other people's works, and well-known works, actually. The trilogy was there, then there was Tarashankar Banerjee's Jalshakar, then The Music Room, then the Philosopher's Stone, Parashpata made from the story by Parashuram, and then Tagore, the Teen Kanya stories, 3 daughter stories came. You see, the first one is to consider what attracts one to a particular story. Whether it's a classic or an unknown piece of work, it doesn't matter. There are certain elements which obviously draw one to the work in the first place. And the director tries to preserve those elements and modify the rest of it or embellish it with inventions of his own, which I have done in every case. I think there are considerable departures in the trilogy. For instance, the original book, the 2 volumes, had something like 300, 400 characters, whereas in the film you encounter only 30 or 40. So characters were dropped, incidents were dropped, they were shuffled around. Sometimes you will find a story which is almost written for the screen. Therefore, there isn't very much modification needed, but at all times one has to recast the story in terms of the cinema, while preserving the spirit of certain major characters, certain major incidents which people remember from the reading of the original work. And that it has to be done. But then, after a point, while working on the script, you just forget the original story or don't look at it again. You have already absorbed it into your system. And what emerges is a combination of you and the original. And that is always what is needed. Well, I never called myself a humanist. I think it's the critics who have given this, that's how they have categorized me, but I have nothing against it, provided it is meant to suggest that I'm interested in human beings and interested in the relationship between human beings. That is something which deeply concerns me, and it has concerned me right from the beginning. I think some of it has come from the reading of literature, Bengali literature. It certainly is an aspect of Vibhuti very much. But again, an individual, after all, belongs to a certain social class, and he carries with him the problems of his class. And when you show a human being in a film, you obviously cannot show him in isolation from his problems, his background, his surrounded, the particular class to which he belongs. And when you bring in other characters, you bring in certain conflicts. And I don't think that it is quite true to say that I stay away from problems or solutions to problems. Certainly there is one thing discernible in my films, which every perceptive viewer will notice, is a moral attitude. Even in the trilogy, you find that the conclusion of the trilogy is very definitely for man taking responsibility. That is the conclusion of the film, rather than stay away from responsibility. And even in some of my early films, like, for instance, The Big City, Mahanagar, you find this woman, this housewife, who has to go out and take a job. And obviously there are lots of people who are against the idea of an ordinary middle-class woman going out and taking the job of a saleswoman. But my attitude is very clear in the film. You, even toward the end, you will see that it definitely suggests that it is a good thing, it's a proper thing in the circumstances for a woman to be doing a job. I really am not very sure of what is meant by a political film. The definition is not very clear for me. Uh, if the element of politics comes into it, for instance, as in Shima Bodho, you have the suggestion of Naxalite disturbances in the background, that bombs are heard and crackers are heard. That's there. And in Ashani Shanket, you have the whole business of the war, which is supposed to be taking place in the background. That obviously gives it a political color, because after all, the famine itself, the 1943 famine, was caused indirectly by the war, because the food was being diverted to the troops. So in that sense, they can be called political films, but I don't see why they should be called political films, except that they are films where there is an element of politics in it, in some form or the other. Like, for instance, in Shatranj Ka Khiladi, that's very much a political film, because it deals with a political event. And that much of politics is certainly can be granted, or whenever necessary, such politics has there to be included in the film. There's nothing one can do about it. In fact, it is necessary occasionally to deal with film, particularly when you're dealing with contemporary subjects. Politics is so very much in the air that you can hardly leave out politics. Either directly or indirectly, obliquely, the element of politics has to come into the film. But violence, just talking of violence, I'm actually much more interested in psychological violence than physical violence. There are two aspects of violence, actually. In fact, for instance, in my very first film, Panchali, I can mention two scenes. One of intense psychological violence, where Durga's mother, Shabuja, is so cruel by implication to the old woman, where she doesn't even offer her food while she herself is eating. And she wants shelter, wants to come back to her own little cottage, but she doesn't let her do so. And she walks away to her death. That is, I think, is intensely violent, that scene, suppressed. Again, in Totifachali, you have the scene of real physical violence, where the mother drags her daughter by the hair and throws her out of the house. You see, that kind of violence is perfectly valid, I think. It was there also in the original. But the other kind of violence, the physical violence, which is so very much in evidence in the cinema of the world today, if I come across a story which contains such violence, and which convincingly and interestingly and dramatically, I would certainly not mind using. I've nothing against using violence. I once had the idea of doing a segment of Mahabharata into a film. Now that, of course, would have contained a great deal of violence. I would have loved to have done that. I think it is adequate for an artist to present certain social problems and suggest the kind of attitude that he's taken to the problem without suggesting a solution, because he may not always have the solution ready. It is, I think, enough if he's able to make people aware of the problem, to make people think about the problem. And of course, the ultimate answer is implicit. It calls for a change. It calls for maybe a revolution. Actually, my family has been closely involved in children's literature for a very long time. My grandfather was a pioneer, and he founded a magazine called Sunday way back in long before I was born, actually 8 or 10 years before I was born. Then after his death, my father took over, and he died in 1923. And soon after his death, I think 2 or 3 years after his death, the magazine folded up. In 1960, we just, on a Sunday, I think, we sat chatting about this and that, and I had a poet friend of mine, Subhash Mukherjee, who casually suggested that why don't we revive this magazine? Immediately struck me as a very interesting idea. And on the spot, we decided to revive Sandesh. This was 1961. And so the magazine came out again. I was the joint editor with Subhash Mukherjee. And it was then, at the age of 40, that I decided to write a Sandesh. First of all, I started by translating poems by Edward Lear, limericks by Lewis Carroll. And then plots began to come to me, story plots. And I started writing stories. Of course, I had read a great deal of children's literature when I was a boy, and certain kinds of literature appealed to me greatly. I was a great admirer of Jules. Actually, I do like from time to time to go back to an earlier period. One of the things, of course, is that this has been happening from fairly early on, because Devi was made in 1960 or 61. It has been my intention not to repeat myself. I like trying out various styles, various genres, various periods, and then occasionally coming back to contemporary times. So it started with Devi. Then in 1963 or 64, I did Charulata. No, earlier on, I did Jataka. But that was, let us say, the not turn of the century, but 1930s. Now, there is a challenge in recreating an earlier period, and I love to face up to this challenge. I love doing research into an earlier period. I love designing costumes of an earlier period. I just want to recapture an earlier period through the cinema. You can do it very effectively. And as I said before, I love to face up to this challenge. I'm fascinated by it. It's just that my interest is fairly widespread. I'm not only interested in my own times. That there is. And if you really work it out, I think more films of mine have dealt with contemporary times than with earlier times. But it's a wonderful challenge, and it's a wonderful exercise to do research into Shatranj ke Khiladi, for instance. It's a chess player, which was incredibly fascinating. It increased my knowledge, and in being able to recreate a period of mid-19th or a little later than that, it gives you a great satisfaction. The system used in scripting is the same in every case. The story which grips my imagination, which I feel would make a film. And once I've decided to make a film off the story, first of all, I do what everyone else does, is do a block treatment. That's where a certain amount of literary effort is expended. After that, it becomes then I would take individual scenes and start working on the dialogue, how the scene works out in terms of dialogue. That I write down, and then particularly some tricky scenes, which I take up first and find out whether it works all right in terms of dialogue. And then it's a question of breaking down. And when I break down the script into a shooting script, then I do a lot of sketching. All the frames are drawn out, and the thing looks on the left hand, down the left hand side are sketches, framed, and on the right hand side are the notes on camera movements and the dialogue. This is not a unique system. It is used by other directors as well. I once went to the Cinematheque and found a script which I thought was mine. It turned out to be Kurosawa. But he uses the identical method. And I'm sure there are other directors who use the same method, because the script is not a literary exercise at all, because words are wasted. So I keep words down to a minimum, just the camera directions, and then dialogue, and then sketches. I can't say that Western music has directly influenced my approach to filmmaking. After all, music, any music, Western or Indian, is an abstract form, whereas film tells a story. So there's a basic difference between the two anyway. But there are certain forms of Western music which evolved in the late 18th century, which is the sonata form, which has a dramatic structure. You have this first subject, which is followed by a second subject. First subject, if it's masculine, the second subject may be feminine, you see. So there's already a contrast between the two. And then there's a developed segment section which follows, where these two themes are combined and they play against each other, so that there's this conflict situation develops between the two themes. And then there's a recapitulation section, and then there's a conclusion big section. So this is a dramatic form which Beethoven used, which Mozart used, where you already have something like the element of a story. What happens to these two subjects? How they go from key to key, and how they turn tragic by a change in key, and how they again then come back to the original form. So that is a vaguely dramatic structure which may have some relationship to the dramatic structure of a story, but not very much. It's superficial, it's not very close. But the question of rhythm, of tempo, of changes in mood, all these relate to film also, because the film, like music also, like Western composed music, exists as an inflexible pattern in time. Whereas in Indian music, as you know, it changes. With one musician can sing a rag for 1 hour, another can. You have a 3-minute record of a raga. So there you have more flexibility, whereas Western music, being composed music, is rigid. I think I was helped particularly in acquiring a sense of tempo and rhythm through my understanding and familiarity with Western music. And even when composing a film, let us say, these are at the back of your mind. I mean, that has to be there. But in actually composing the music for the film, the real work is done at the very last stage, after the film is completely ready and I have all the footage that I need for the music. But stray ideas, little germs of themes, may occur even when I'm working on the script. And then I would jot it down in my book for possible use at a later stage, or it may be abandoned and a new theme might emerge. But really the final work of composing the music comes at the very end, when the film is absolutely ready and when you have all the footage and when you know the structure of the film, how it moves, the rhythm of the film, the pace of the film, when you know that you have that right in front of you, then you really compose the music. American films are the films which I actually learned the craft of filmmaking from, because in those days, let's say in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, American films are the only films that we got to see in Calcutta. And since by that time I had already developed a very serious interest in the cinema, I watched them very carefully and made mental notes of about cutting, about placement of camera, about various other things that go into making a film. Neorealism, of course, I was exposed to much later. It was in 1950 when I went to London. The first film I saw was Bicycle Pete. By that time, of course, I had already the idea of making Panchali at the back of my mind. And I was discouraged in Calcutta by professional filmmakers saying that you can't work with amateur actors, you can't work entirely in outdoors, you have to use the conditions of the studio, etc. Now, this is a film, Bicycle Thief, which gave a lie to such statements. And I could see that the seeker had done exactly what I had in my own mind to do. Use new people, shoot on location, and even work with fairly indifferent technical equipment, because those were wartime, after the war, and they were using different kinds of stock during the film. It didn't matter because the film had such a tremendous flow that any variations in density from shot to shot really didn't matter. So that is very, very inspiring. When I say neorealist, I shall mention only De Sica, really, because he was, in a way, my mentor as far as the using of non-professionals and various other things, the density of a film, the amount of details that can be crammed into a thought or into a scene, all that was already there in De Sica. But when it actually came to making my first film, it was the subject matter which dictated the style of the film, the use of the camera, use of the editing. In other words, I had learned what I had learned from De Sica, but I was trying to be as faithful to the writer of the novel, Vibhuti as possible. So it was that which was guiding me. The guiding principle was faithfulness to the spirit of the original book. Eisenstein, I had read his theoretical book, Film Sense and Film Form. And of course, they were fascinating. They were very difficult books, very abstruse occasionally. But I found it fascinating. But I cannot say that his style of filmmaking influenced me in any way. I think my style has very little relationship to the style of Eisenstein. Whereas Renoir, whom I personally met in 1948 when he first came to Recamator for locations. And the long talks that I had with Renoir, they were most instructive. Again, the question of details, again, question of using the quintessential elements in the Bengali surrounding the landscape, which he was himself doing for the river, and which he would insist again and again that you don't have to use too many elements in a film. You have to pick some very expressive, typical elements, and that does the work. So Renoir, and also his attitude to human beings, the way he handled his actors, the way he handled the relationships, the complexity of the characters, all that left a very deep impression on me. And I think subconsciously I have been paying a tribute to Renoir throughout my filmmaking career, and also to a certain extent to the seeker. Well, I think I ought first to mention the Japanese, because I think Kurosawa is one of the giants of the cinema, and I greatly admire him. One or two other Japanese ought to be mentioned, but they are not contemporary, really. But Mizoguchi, people I have learned from. Mizoguchi is definitely there, to a certain extent Ozu also. Among the others, there is, of course, Bergman, whom I greatly admire, particularly for his intensity, and he has a marvelous stock company. His actors are superb, and he gets the most extraordinarily detailed acting from his actors. And among the Italians, well, there was a time when I used to admire Fellini very much, but his recent films are not really up my street. I mean, I can admire him as a technician. He's a wizard, but he's not perhaps a director of my heart. Among the Polish, Wajda, Kawalerowicz, I do admire very much. And hello. Among the Polish, Wajda, Kawalerowicz, I do admire very much. And hello, Topore Ponkoven. Then there is among the Americans, the French, Truffaut, I have greatly admired for his dexterity, for his agility, for his lightness of touch. Early Godard. Now Godard is alien to me, but early Godard, for his revolutionary approach to filmmaking, I have greatly admired. And Americans, of course, there is Kubrick. Kubrick, I'm fascinated by what he does all the time because he's a superb technician. Not that his subject matters greatly appeal to me. There's Coppola there, who's again a fantastic craftsman, and in a film like The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, there are fantastic, wonderful passages which you cannot help admiring. Those, I would say, are the main directors who have, who I do greatly admire. Among my own contemporaries here, I think I ought to mention Hrithik Ghatak, whom we lost about 5 or 6 years ago. He is one director who can be said to have been influenced greatly by Eisenstein. So his style, his approach is not mine. It's very different, and therefore unique. Actually, to be quite honest, the most perceptive reviews of my films have come from the West. There's no question of that. That's one of the reasons, of course. The obvious reason is that the level of sophistication there is much higher. The understanding of the film medium is much more acute. So that even in judging a film like Devi, they do miss out on certain cultural aspects. There's no question of that. They wouldn't know about this mother cult, the whole cult of Kali and all. They wouldn't know. But the other elements, the moral aspect, and the aspect which deal with the craft of cinema that they understand very, very well. There are certain things which they never can expect can be expected to understand. For instance, if you show a woman in white, how many foreigners will know that it's a widow? Or if you show a Bengali woman with red sindoor in her parting, how many would know that she's a married woman? They think that red here is the sign of marriage, which is not true, of course. But apart from that, there's a stumbling block there. But gradually, they are learning. They are being exposed more and more to Indian cinema. And I think the critics have started doing a bit of homework also before they see a film. They read the original novel, for one thing. And they read a bit about Indian culture. So that, combined with the fact that they really know the cinema, hello, একটু পরে ফোন করবেন. The general feeling I get from reading reviews is that they are getting deeper into the film than our own critics. Certainly from the aspect of aesthetics. They do understand much more. And they understand more now than in the early days, the days of Panchali. At the time of Panchali, I've even heard that people were so put off by the sight of Indians eating with their fingers that they reacted very, very strongly. And there's a couple of women walked out of the New York cinema or something like that. She just couldn't stand the sight of Indians eating with their fingers. But those days are gone, I think. I think with more exposure to Indian film, they're understanding even more now. In any case, their sophistication and their understanding of the medium helps a lot. Actually, my attachment to Calcutta grows from the fact that I was born here, I was brought up here, I had my schooling here, and I worked here. And it gives me an extra confidence when I make a film here in the language that I know, about people that I know, in surroundings that I'm familiar with. So there's an obvious connection with Calcutta and an obvious reason why I prefer working here than elsewhere. But of course, occasionally I've had to move from here in the sense, for instance, when I made my couple of Hindi films, Sadgati was made in Madhya Pradesh, and Shatranj Ke Khilari had a Lucknow setting. But the language there and the stories demanded a change of locale. But normally, I feel very at home working here for the reasons that I've mentioned. I have received offers from abroad right from early on. Soon after Panchali, offers came to me from American producers. A man like Selznick was after me for a long time, trying to persuade me to make a film for him. But I turned them down because I don't think I would have the same amount of confidence working outside of my home. And my attachment to Calcutta is very obvious. I mean, I don't even have to account for it. I mean, the very fact that I was born here and lived all my life here, and because I speak the Bengali language, it's my own language, and I know the milieux here, the various milieux that I show in my films, it accounts for the fact that I'm most at home working in Calcutta. Actually, it's not the same routine throughout the year. It can change. It can vary from time to time. It's one thing when I'm working on a film. It's another when I'm working on a script. It can be quite something else when I'm either editing my magazine or writing a story or a novel or whatever. But generally, I'm sitting in this chair at least 12 hours a day. And my day begins with how to deal with my correspondence. I get a large mail every day. It may consist of letters, official letters. It may consist of letters from my fans, not my film fans, by the way. Generally, the fans of my short stories and just stories for children. I get lots of letters from young boys and girls. And all those have to be on naturally. And the rest of the day I can be either writing or sketching or preparing a film. It depends on that. I think I've led a very full life. I've also been successful in various ways. Actually, the success came with my very first film, so I had a firm footing right from there. And from then on, it has been one unending round of work of various kinds, not just filmmaking. I've done other things. I've written, I've edited a magazine, I have sketched and done illustrations, and of course made films, written original stories, and been successful in many fields. And it's been very heartening, and it gives me a sense of fulfillment, certainly. Definitely, there's no question about it. One becomes aware of death at a certain age, I suppose, from the age of 50 onwards. One does think about it once in a while, especially when one begins to lose some of one's contemporaries. But I keep so busy doing this, that, and the other that I have hardly any time to either be morbid or about it or brood about it. It will come when it does come, but I'm not concerned with it at all. I want to keep working.